Genesis chapter 12. There we go. Switch from the microphone that gives me a headache to the one that doesn't. All right. Man, it's a high song, isn't it? Like, I told Chris, I said, I think by the time we get to the second service, you're going to have to turn me up way loud because I'm about done. Or you pick up just from the end of chapter 11, real quick, verse 27. We're going to attempt to squeeze the life of Abraham into a brief period of time tonight, or this morning. Let's start. This is where we're introduced to him in Genesis 11, verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no children. Very short statement, but very, very significant in the Abraham narrative. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Flip over to chapter 15. A lot of ground takes place between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, but I want to pick it up here because I think this is the crux, one of the central aspects, the central parts of the Abraham narrative. Genesis 15, God again is going to speak to Abram as he did there in chapter 12. That initial promise in chapter 12, he appears to him again here, speaks to him again. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue, the key word there, I continue childless. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside. And he said, look toward the heaven. And number the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And we'll stop right there for you. But first of all, never, ever, ever preach a sermon on patience and waiting when you're doing construction on your house. Like the past 2 weeks, it has been a comedy. We have a great contractor, nothing to do with him, but just the little things. Inspector can't show up today, and this little thing puts a kink in the works. In the past couple of weeks, God has been saying, see? And I've been saying, no, I preach this for them, not me. The car dies one morning, and I had to leave in the street with a dead battery. And that night I had to run out, got in my van, went to drive out, wondered why both headlights blew on my car. I'm like, how does that happen? And, took that back. And then we had a room go dead electrically on Friday. No breaker was tripped, just the room didn't work anymore. What was that all about? And then we woke up yesterday morning and the heater didn't work. And I'm like down in the basement going, okay, I get it. You want me to empathize with people. Fine, thank you. But never preach a sermon on patience when you're doing construction on your house. And waiting stinks, doesn't it? Waiting. I want to get this done. I want this to be resolved. This trial, this issue, I want to know now. I want it fixed now. Sometimes these things are, really like waiting in line at Walmart, waiting in traffic on 28th Street. Those are frustrating. Those are shallow things. But some of you are walking through times much darker than that. Is God going to bring this job? I thought of Dave. When's God going to bring me a place where I can minister? This is Dave's heart. I thought of Gabe and Ann. We were sitting in Sunday school last week, just saying our life is just a struggle right now. The health issue. We're waiting on God. God, what are you doing? It's frustrating. Dissonance in our minds. We lay in bed at night, wake up in the middle of the night, we can't get back to sleep because we just want resolution, and it's not coming. And the problem with those times is that it often feels like God's forgotten us. So I wanted to sing that song this morning, that second one was saying, plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. I need that reminder. For us, I think one of the hardest times of waiting for us was after we lost our first baby, a miscarriage, and it was the first one, so you're walking through this time, can we have kids? Is it even possible? And you have to play that waiting game where, you have to have the procedure then to remove the baby, and then you have to wait until you can try to get pregnant again. And then you have in your mind, you're very aware of when that time happened, that point in the pregnancy when you lost that first baby, and you're waiting for that, and you're waiting for the ultrasound, you're waiting to see the heartbeat, then you're sitting in that ultrasound room, and they're fishing around, and you're saying, just hurry up, just let me see that heartbeat, and you're waiting for that. And I remember that time in our lives, and it's just like, God, you can't do anything to fix it. You can't do anything to speed it up. It's just God operating on His time and His way, and sometimes that leaves us incredibly frustrated, and sometimes that leaves us incredibly fearful, alone, feeling. God has a habit of working in that way. Throughout the redemptive history. Jeff talked last week. I'd never thought about that before. The time between Abel dying and Seth being born was 100 years, right? So God makes Adam and Eve wait 100 years. Abraham, we'll talk about that in a second. Joseph in prison in Egypt, forgotten, left there, right? God's people in bondage in Egypt. Moses' exile in the wilderness. David waiting. We've been studying David waiting while Saul, who's just messing everything up, but David waits in the wilderness on the run. The psalmists over and over again who cry out, "How long, God? How long?" You have Habakkuk who can't figure out for the life of him why God is going to use the Babylonians to wipe out Israel. Jeremiah, the other prophets who ministered during this time. How long, God? When are you going to fix this? When are you going to bring the Messiah? Mary and Martha who wait 3 days for Jesus to show up to heal Lazarus, and he dies. And what do they think? Jesus, you're too late. How many times do we feel that way in our lives? God, you're too late. You should have showed up earlier, Mary and Martha say to him with broken hearts. They had 400 years of silence between the Testaments. You have the martyrs before the throne in Revelation. And how long, God? How long before you avenge our deaths? God sometimes has this frustrating habit of making us wait. And we need to be okay with that this morning. We have to remember that he does accomplish his purposes, that the thin threads of redemptive history and the thin threads of our lives are thin only from our perspective, not from his. In the big picture of things, his sovereignty has brought about the work of redemption in spite of how it often looked like it wouldn't come to pass. Such as Seth last week, the life of Abraham this week. And ultimately, God's power and sovereignty will bring you in your life, whatever it is you need. Not necessarily what you want, but what is best for you. Things will work out. Let's look at Abraham and see how this all played out in his life. And just by way of background, here, just to give you kind of set it in the context, we talked about Cain and Abel and Seth and Adam and Eve last week. Between Genesis 1 and Genesis 11, it covers a lot of time. A lot of time. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years between chapters 1 and 11. You get to the end of chapter 11 and chapter 12 of Genesis, and things slow way down. It's like the brakes just get hit on redemptive history, because all of a sudden now there's a narrower focus. Genesis narrows here to be at the end of chapter 11, and this demonstrates the significance of the Abraham narrative in God's redemptive plan. Okay? This family is significant now. This family matters. Ultimately, God's choosing of this family of Abraham and his descendants is going to be the means by which he will bring about Messiah. And as he chooses this family, once again, the thread's going to seem really long, really thin. But God appears to Abram over and over again to remind him it's not as thin as you think it is. My promises will come to pass. But this is key. The Abraham narrative is one of the key narratives in all Scripture and redemptive history. This is why Genesis slows way down here and narrows now. And the time of Genesis 12 to 50 is very disproportionate to the amount of time between Genesis 1 and 11. Again, because of the focus here in redemptive history. So like I said, let's look at Abraham. And specifically, let's dissect some aspects of his life, see if we can bring them to bear where we're at today. First of all, Abraham faced several challenges that seemed to be contrary to God's plan and promises. Abram faced several challenges that seemed to be contrary to God's plan and promises. Anyone experiencing that this morning? Experiencing challenges, trials, and circumstances that just seem to be contrary to the promises of God. Thinking of Abraham's story right away, I emphasize that line at the end of chapter 11. Now, Sarai was barren. That's important. Sarai wasn't just old. But she was barren. She couldn't have children. Well, it seems contrary to the promise of a great nation coming out of Abraham, right? Because to have a great nation, there has to be a baby. If you're barren, no baby. It seems to be contrary to God's promises, and yet God is throwing it out there. This is what I'm going to do. You continue on, even there in chapter 11, you think about who Abraham was. There's another aspect of the line that makes it, of the thread that makes it seem thin. God's choosing of Abram, in and of itself, is an interesting choice. And sometimes the people God uses is just incredible to me. Abram, the text specifically points out over and over again where Abram's from. He's from Ur of the Chaldeans. In Judges, it's very specific. It points out that Abram's father was a worshiper of idols. So in Abram, you have a man chosen here who didn't really know anything about who this God was. Comes from a family of idol worshipers. From a city that's known for its pagan worship and its ziggurat. And this is the guy that God is choosing to make a great nation out of. And God chooses the unlikely. It might be how some of them felt. I mean, you know this, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. It might be how some of them felt in that initial fellowship of the ring when they chose a hobbit to carry the ring. That makes no sense. The hobbit. You know, pick Aragorn or someone who, looks buff and has the cool hair. The hobbit. He's got bad hair. It's just unlikely. God, the thread seems thin here. Abram. And then what God asks of him, right? Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house. Each one kind of is a ratcheting up of intensity. I want you to leave everything that has identified you. I want you to leave everything that brings you security. Walk away from it now. Pagan, idol worshiper guy who doesn't really know Yahweh. Yahweh appears to him and says, I want you to walk away from everything. What? God can use people like that? Yeah. He gave up much to follow God's instruction. Genesis 12. We hit it there real quick. When we got at the beginning, he does obey God. Abram says, okay. And he leaves. He leaves Ur. Later he leaves Haran. A great parallel passage, by the way, if you want to look at it later, is Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 5 in Stephen's sermon there. Stephen kind of gives a little bit more insight into Abraham's thoughts and how God led and directed him. But he leaves. And isn't it interesting then, and we didn't read this part, but he arrives in Canaan in Genesis chapter 12, this land that God promised to give him. Here it is, Abram. This is going to be yours. Okay, he leaves everything that's brought him security. He leaves everything that is tied to his identity. He goes to this land that God has promised to give him, shows up, and there's a famine. If it's me, I'm walking around Canaan going, oh yeah, great land, God. I left Ur. There was a Taco Bell on every corner. There's nothing to eat here. All the Outbacks are closed, Right? Here's your land, Abram. There's a famine. Seems contrary to God's promise, doesn't it? What do? Let's go to Egypt. Interesting, at this part of the story, it never consults God in this movie. But let's go to Egypt. As we're walking to Egypt, Abram begins to think, you know what? This could be dangerous for us. Apparently, Sarai was hot. Good to look at. But Abram was worried, we're going to get to Egypt, and Pharaoh's going to want her. He's going to kill me to get her. So now Abraham's thinking, right, here we go. The line the thread is thin again. That's hard. The thread is thin. I can't get that out. The thread is thin. it's thin again because he's thinking, I may lose my life in Egypt. So he tells Sarah, hey, why don't we lie and tell them that you're my sister so they won't kill me. Okay. And sure enough, they get there and Pharaoh takes Sarai. So now Abraham's a bachelor. You can't have a line without the wife. The wife's gone. Pharaoh's taking her. That's what he's doing. Eventually, divine intervention kicks in because God brings plagues to Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh puts two and two together and isn't real happy with Abram, but gives Sarai back and says, get out. Which, by the way, fascinating study at some time. Look at this one. You talk about foreshadowing. How Scripture does. It's amazing, right? There's another time when God used plagues to get his people out of Egypt. How Scripture ties together. It's pretty awesome. So they leave Egypt because God has spared them. Genesis 16. Still without children, Abram takes matters into his own hands and has intercourse with Hagar, Sarai's maidservant, and has a child, Ishmael, which presents its own set of challenges and struggles. And we don't take the time to look at, but again, another set of struggles and circumstances now coming into Abram's life and just fogging things up. And then lastly, look at Genesis 22, after the fact, after Isaac is born, and God says, I want you to take him up to Mount Moriah, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. See, all throughout Abram's life and there continues to be circumstances and struggles. Make it seem like God doesn't know what he's doing. Contrary to the promises. There are obstacles that seem like they will frustrate God's plan before it even gets started. But ultimately for Abram, you had all of those struggles, but the biggest one for him was the waiting. Was the passage of time between the promise and the birth of the child. Last week we saw it was 100 years for Seth. For Abram, it was 25 years between the promise and the birth of Isaac. And he has to wait. I get frustrated when I have to wait 2 days, for an inspector to show up at the house. He had to wait 25 years. You can see why Abram struggled. You can see why there was fear. And God tells him too, oh, by the way, you're going to have to wait like 4 generations before really the land is yours too. Right? You don't have the land yet either, and you're not going to have, because before you have it, your offspring are going to be taken into a land as captives, a land that's not theirs, and they're going to be oppressed. The circumstances, just come on. They keep piling up. What are you doing? And again, this is what God does, right? He works in amazing ways in the most unlikely of circumstances. Noah built a boat. There's no water. In fact, it's never rained. You build it anyways. Abram, pack up and leave your homeland. Joseph, get sold into slavery and then stay in prison. Moses, go face off against Pharaoh. My people, walk across a sea. I will dry it up for you. A shepherd boy, the youngest of his family, who's actually picked to be king. A Babylonian empire that will carry God's people away into exile. A virgin, a manger, a cross. No, God uses the most unlikely of circumstances and things to accomplish his plan and purposes. And in those times, we can think that God has forgotten us. In those times, we can think that the thread is thin. But it's in those times when God is saying, sit back, get ready to see my best work yet. And in whatever circumstance you're sitting in today, God is waiting to work it out for you in his time and his way for his glory. I just alluded to this. Abram's faith was challenged the most by the long wait for an heir. And that's why we we read Genesis 15, because this seems to be the crisis point for Abram. The awesome thing is, it's also the place where God meets him in his crisis point. And here, catch this, it's key, right? While God doesn't change Abram's circumstances in Genesis 15, he offers himself and his promise to him. I think that's key in Genesis 15. It's the crisis point. God shows up, doesn't change his circumstances. But speaks truth to him and offers himself to him. Look at the chapter here with me again. Chapter 15. Starts out, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. After what things? If we look back at chapter 14, Abram actually is coming off a pretty good time of his life. Lot had been captured by a coalition of kings who were at war and been taken away. Abram throws together an army of his men, his servants, and they go and they conquer. They have score a major victory. And they capture back Lot. They get all the possessions. They're coming back. Here's a major military victory against some of the major powers in Canaan. Abraham takes care of business there. And then on the way back, he runs into Melchizedek, the priest of Salem, Jerusalem. Melchizedek, a key figure in the narrative of Scripture. And Abraham realizes who this man is, priest of the Most High God. And Abraham has camp right there, man. I mean, he has like the best worship experience ever. He meets Melchizedek, and Melchizedek, the great priest of Salem, blesses Abram. This is chapter 14. So it's after these things. I mean, this is a high. This is a great time in Abram's life. Yet something is still lurking in the background for Abraham, as we see reflected in the words that God is about to say to him. By the way, this speaks to the nature of life in a broken world. Right? Discouragement can come. There'll be ups and downs. Here's the great high, but there's still discouragement in Abraham's life. And we see that he's struggling, because what's the first thing that God says to him in verse 1? Fear not, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. God feels the need to encourage him. Even after what seems to be a great high point for Abraham, we see that something must be troubling him, given the fact that God shows up and feels the need to tell him not to fear and to tell him who he is. And God tells him the solution to your fear, Abraham, right? He says, I'm your shield. I'm your great reward. And so then the floodgates open up for Abraham. And he expresses his fear to God, the fear that he may not have any children. This is the first time Abraham speaks to God in the narrative. The first time it's recorded, at least. And note, what is it? It's complaint. It's complaint. Abraham speaks back to God, complaining about his continued childlessness. His patience is wearing thin because, after all, he had left, wandered, been endangered in Egypt in his battle for Lot, all without complaint. But now it's coming to a head for him. I left my country. I left my people. I left my father. I came to a land where there was a famine. I almost lost my life in Egypt. Then I had to fight a battle because of Lot. I have no kids. He just lays it out to God. Someone's like, God coming to him and saying, I'm going to take care of you. And Abraham's like, you keep saying that. I have no kids. Love this. God says, Abram, go outside. Just go outside. Okay. Abram walks outside and God says, look up. Just stop. Look up. Count the stars. And I love the little phrase that's in there. If you are able. Right in that statement, right, there's a reminder. God knew Abraham wasn't able to count the stars. God is implying, I know how many there are. A reminder of who God is. I love that. Go upstairs. Just be reminded of who I am. Count the stars if you're able. Oh, you're not. Well, let me tell you. I know how many there are, and your offspring are going to number. Maybe somebody sitting here this morning, you need to go outside. You need to stop. You need to listen to God say to you, what's that? Be quiet. Remember this morning who I am. God is God, and Abraham is limited. The turning point then comes for Abraham in verse 6. He believes. He believes God. The word believe there, it means to trust even when trust seems unwarranted. And God counts it to him as righteousness. The trust seemed unwarranted. Every circumstance in his life is screaming otherwise. But the word of God has come to him, and Abram says, okay, I put my faith. And you can tell it was authentic and real because of the way God responded. Every morning I drive my girls to school, and some mornings I take our van. And Maggie, every morning, it just struck me this week. The kids get out. Maggie doesn't even wait. The van's a little bit higher off the ground. She never waits. She never says anything to me. But she gets out of her seat and buckles, grabs her backpack, and she jumps at me. And it just struck me this week. She's done this forever. And it just struck me this week. I think probably something. And I always catch her. I hug her, kiss her, and I put her down. She runs off to the bus. And she jumped to me this week. I did that, and I put her down. And I'm like, she never asks me if I'm ready. She never says, Daddy, you ready? Daddy, you going to catch me? She jumps out of the van. Because she knows I'm going to catch her. But a couple times I've almost dropped her because she caught me off guard. But, the God we serve, you can jump out of the van every single time without asking if he's ready. Because he's got you. In verse 7, God gives Abram once again a promise, and this time he links the divine name to it. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. He links the promise to the divine name. And then I love the past and future perspective here. Brought you out of Canaan, or out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land. There's a past and a future aspect there. What a great focus there in times of doubt. God's faithfulness in the past combined with his promises of the future. I'm the God who brought you up. I'm the God who's going to give you that. In those times of discouragement, those times of doubt, that's the discipline we need to cultivate. Is to sit down and say, okay, what has God done? How has he shown himself faithful over and over and over and over again? And he has. Then you stop and think, what does God promise? Promise this, and this. That is a great formula to help us overcome doubt, struggle. The tie to the divine name is also significant. The divine formula legitimizes the credentials of the one introducing himself and speaks particularly of the availability of resources of the vision speaker to the vision receiver. I love that. Speaks of the availability of the resources available. I am the Lord. That means he has every resource available at his disposal. The attachment to the divine name. Abraham asks how he is to know that he will possess the land. It's interesting to me here that God doesn't rebuke Abraham for asking this question. There are times in Scripture when people come back to God and ask why or how, and God rebukes them. He doesn't do that with Abraham here. And I can only assume, based on the context and based on that statement above we just talked about, Abraham believed God, and God counted to him as righteousness. It was the orientation of Abraham's heart here as he was asking this question. There's something in the orientation of his heart that God was okay with the doubt. He was okay with the struggle here, the fear, the question. Abraham says, how am I supposed to know that I'm supposed to possess the land? And God says, all right, do this. You just cut up a bunch of animals. And this covenant scene here at the end of 15 is incredible. I'm going to take the time to totally unpack it, but here's the deal. That wasn't an uncommon practice in what's called cutting a covenant. Making a covenant with you, we're going to do a ritual, and this was one of the rituals that could be done. And the idea was to line up these bloody animals on either side, and then the two parties of the covenant would walk through that path, that bloody path between the animals, and that would affirm and ratify the covenants. What's fascinating here is that God puts Abram to sleep. Abraham cuts the animals, lays them out. God puts him to sleep, and you see then the dread communicated to us that Abraham is feeling as Yahweh presents himself there. It's the big moment. But then what's interesting is there are not two parties that walk through the bloody trail, as would normally be the case. There's only one. And it's not Abram. It is God. Taking full responsibility for the fulfillment of the promises. God is taking ownership. God is walking through the bloody path all by himself. He is swearing by himself. He is putting the responsibility for the fulfillment of the covenant squarely on himself. The obligation lies on Yahweh. The point here is the unconditional nature of God's covenant. This is the God we are dealing with this morning. A God who keeps his word. A God who keeps his promises. Time may go longer than we ever wanted to. Circumstances may stack up that we struggle with. But the God who walked through the bloody path all by himself is the God you serve this morning. The God who rescues us, saves us through the death of his Son, Jesus Christ, on the cross, promises us to indwell us and to be with us until the end of the age, and then gives us all these wonderful promises in the book of Revelation about dwelling with him on a new earth for all of eternity. That God has made that a new covenant and a New Testament. And he's just as faithful now as he was then. He's taken it upon himself, and I'm so thankful for that this morning, because if it was dependent on us, if we had to walk through that path with him and have some of that depending on us, we'd be in a mess. God guarantees Abram here. God leaves no doubt then that the ultimate destiny of Abraham's descendants is secure. Lastly, Abraham's faith in Yahweh slowly grows, but still susceptible to lapses as he waits on the fulfillment of God's promises. Even after he grows, and even after we grow sometimes in our faith, God's speed, quote unquote, can lead us to fear if we're impatient and not properly oriented toward him. This can lead us to getting ahead of God and taking things into our own hands, which can put us in a bad place. And Abraham does that in chapter 16. It's very interesting to me. Right after this great moment, the covenant is cut, and so on, chapter 16, Sarah says, Lord, this isn't working out like we wanted to. Take my maidservant, let's have a baby by her, which was totally, culturally, would have been an acceptable practice. Let's just do it this way. Abraham says, okay. Just a little ahead of God there. And we don't have time to look at it. All kinds of consequences came from that one. Family strife. Abraham ends up having a son, Ishmael, who he loves, cares about deeply. But it's not the child of the promise. Ultimately, Abraham has to send his son away, who he loves. But you see throughout the narrative, Abraham is very concerned about Ishmael. There's some heartache there now, because he gets ahead of God. You see the struggle continue, even in chapter 17. Abraham, our God again, tells him about the promises. He says, Abraham laughs. Now, why God rebukes Sarai later on for laughing and doesn't rebuke Abram here, it's hard to discern what's going on in the heart. But again, it must have been something just different in the heart. He's like, you keep telling me that. Wow. I'm old, God. The awesome thing about it all that Abraham ultimately does learn. He does learn to hang on to the promises of God. He does come to understand what God is like. This unfolds in Genesis chapter 22. God says, I want you to go sacrifice your son. And you look at it, God is just, the narration is brilliant. I want you to go take your son, your only son, your son whom you love. So God's laying it on here. I want you to go take him and sacrifice him. This man who has struggled at times with believing God, he struggled at times with the promise. He picks up his son and he takes Isaac to Mount Moriah. And you need to catch what he says as he walks up that mountain. He turns to his servants in Genesis 22 and he says, wait here. Isaac and I are going up the mountain to make a sacrifice, and we will return. We are going up to make a sacrifice. Usually if two people are going up the top of a mountain and one of them's going to kill the other one, there's no we coming back. We're going to go up, make a sacrifice, and we will return. Something clicked in Abram. I don't know what God's going to do. We find out later on, reading Hebrews, that Abram believed, even though he had never seen this happen before. God made this promise. He can bring him back from the dead. Hebrews says that Abraham had that going on in his mind. Which, again, is fascinating. We have all the scripture. We know that God raised people from the dead. Abraham had never seen it. Abraham had never read the Gospels. You see that? He just believed that this is the kind of God I supposed to bring him back from the dead, and he learns. One really awesome thread through this that I wish we had time to unpack, but we don't as we close here. You look at the names of God that are mentioned throughout Genesis 11 through Genesis 22. Greg talked about the divine name. I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. Hagar in chapter 16, verse 13, calls him El Roi, the God who sees. Chapter 17, verse 1, God refers to himself as El Shaddai, God Almighty. Even Ishmael's name in Genesis 16:4, God hears. All those name clues are incredibly important because they're all reminders of who God is in the midst of doubt, struggle, and frustration. The song, if you get a chance to go home today and listen to it, it's been one of my favorite songs here recently. It's called Glorious Unfolding by Stephen Chris Chapman. And just thought about this a lot in the past several months in our own lives as God has worked, and we look back and we see certain things. Why did we have miscarriages? Why did God do this? Why did God do that? And we're at a point where we're bringing a little baby into our family who God is opening the door for us to take in. By the way, we get him Thursday. Glorious Unfolding. The verse of that song goes, lay your head down tonight, take a rest from the fight, don't try to figure it out. Just listen to what I'm saying. And know this is not how you thought the story of your life would turn out. And your struggles and doubts, and think God's not there, but it's just not true. This is going to be a glorious unfolding. God, the thread of my life seems thin. It does. It's part of a glorious unfolding. The story of redemption hit its bumps, its thin times, but it's part of a glorious unfolding. That baby was born in Bethlehem. That great nation was established. The Church of Jesus Christ is alive and well today. Abraham's family has become a blessing to the entire earth. And one day there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And a glorious unfolding. It's going to continue. In the ups and downs of our life, somehow, some way, we don't understand, contribute to that. And that is marvelous in our lives. God, thank you for your faithfulness, your promises. Keep your word. Encourage those who need to be built up today, God. Show them the times in redemptive history where the thread seemed thin, and yet over and over again you showed yourself faithful. And we're celebrating the birth of this baby Jesus, this Advent season, a testament to the faithfulness to your promises. Encourage those who need to be encouraged today. In Jesus' name we pray.